Welcome to the Savage Nation. I'm Michael Savage. This week's topic is a little difficult and a little risky in some ways, which is I've asked, what is the Pope's true legacy? Now, first of all, to offer any criticism of a major religious uh, figure is risky to begin with. People will say, who the hell are you to make such statements? What right have you to make those statements? Hold on just a minute, because you'll find out that although I'm quite critical of this liberation theologist Pope, who I pray for, by the way, uh, the last few popes were not like him. They were not like him at all. And I've asked on my social media, what do you think is the Pope's true legacy? And I'll read the comments of the people. Most people in America who see themselves as politically conservative have seen through Pope Francis from the day he was foisted upon the world stage. After all, he has a history. He was a bouncer in Argentina, I believe. And just like Obama, he was put into this position. So I'm going to go back a little bit in case you think I'm an apostate who doesn't like Catholics. You're 100% wrong. I think Catholicism is a beautiful religion. In fact, a Catholic viewer sent me this a while ago, which I still carry with me, even though I am not Catholic, because I believe in the power of prayer, the power of God, and the power of all of the world's religions when they're oriented towards God, not towards politics. So I asked an Orthodox rabbi, what should I do for God talk today? And he said, well, I don't know. He didn't say I don't know. He said immediately, why don't you read the prayer, Al Tirah, of the Siddur? It said that three young children told these verses to Mordecai, the leader of the Jews in ancient Persia, and it gave him much comfort in facing the difficulties he was dealing with. So I looked at it. It's a very short prayer, and I'll read it to you. Do not, and this is dedicated to the Pope who's suffering right now, and let's pray that he survives the health condition that he is living with. He's 88 years old. Do not fear sudden terror, nor the destruction of the wicked when it comes. Contrive a scheme, but it will be foiled. Conspire a plot, but it will not materialize. For God is with us. To your old age, I'm with you. To your elder years, I will sustain you. I have made you, and I will carry you. I will sustain you and deliver you. Indeed, the righteous will extol your name. The upright will dwell in your presence. Amen. That is dedicated to the Pope, and we hope that he recovers from his difficult situation right now. But I want to go back to the question, the political question, which is the Pope's true legacy, because every time I turn the TV on, you hear them speaking in hushed tones when they mention the Pope's name. Have they lost their minds? The Pope is a man. He's not God. Can't you analyze the fact that there have been popes for thousands of years, some good, some bad, some great, some evil? Do you understand that? Now, I know that as part of their ongoing war on religion, leftists regularly attack conservative popes. In fact, they called the Pope during World War II Hitler's Pope. And frankly, they used this against Pope Benedict XVI. It's true that Pope Benedict had been in the Hitler Youth, but only because it was legally mandated for all 14-year-old boys in Germany at the time. It was the same as being drafted into the army. Had he not joined, they would have come to his house and made him join. Those are the facts, but facts are immaterial to the left. They have an agenda. And Pope Benedict, being a Nazi at the time, fit that agenda at that time, no matter what the evidence was to the contrary. It wasn't the first time they ran that the Pope is a Nazi campaign. You may remember the 1999 book, Hitler's Pope by John Cornwell. In it, Cornwell elaborates on a charge made previously against Pope Pius XII in Rolf Hochhuth's 1963 play, The Deputy. Both claim Pope Pius XII helped the Nazis because as Cardinal Secretary of State of the Church, he signed the Reichskonkordat. The Reichskonkordat was an agreement with the German government stipulating that clergy would refrain from certain political activity in exchange for guarantees of the Catholic Church's rights. This, the left argued, helped legitimize the Nazi regime and stifle criticism against it. Now, never mind that this agreement was not signed by Hitler and doesn't even mention the Nazi Party. Forget that Pope Pius actually saved many Jews from the Holocaust was called a mouthpiece of Jewish war criminals by the Nazis themselves and was mourned as a hero by Jews all over the world upon his death in 1958. Even Cornwell himself has largely backed away from the allegations that he made against the Pope, Pope Pius, in his own book. But again, leftists aren't interested in facts. They're interested in their agenda, and the Pope is a Nazi, fit their agenda. The Pope and his influence over billions of Catholics stands in the way of their plans for a godless, socialist world order. So, in addition to attacking religion in every public space, the left attacks the Pope when doing so meets their needs. Notice they have not attacked the poor Pope who is suffering right now. And that is because I have written about this. This is nothing new to me. I studied this in great detail. And a number of years ago, I wrote a book called Government Zero. And in it, there's a chapter entitled Zero Religion, Lenin's Pope. And I will continue my discussion of this and then take the listeners' comments and read them to you on today's broadcast. Now, this was not the case, as I said, with Pope Francis, because he is not a spiritual leader. He is a political operative. He is a political operative with all the earmarks of having been handpicked for his office the way Barack Obama was picked for his. It would not be the first time the Vatican has been occupied by a political rather than a spiritual leader. The papacy is 2,000 years old. It has had good periods and bad periods, as has any long-standing institution run by imperfect human beings. There were popes who were honest, wise, and deeply spiritual, and others who were morons, scoundrels, or worse. There were times when the papacy was the spiritual center of the Catholic faith, and times when it was little more than a political office, complete with rule over large areas of land and armies commanded by the Pope to enforce that rule. Pope John XII was definitely an example of the latter. He was simultaneously the secular prince of Rome and the Pope, but he acted more like the pagan Roman Emperor Caligula. He was accused of turning the sacred palace into a whorehouse, fornicating with several women in that place, including his own niece, and then blinding his confessor. That was Pope John XII. He put deviant liberals in Hollywood to shame. He made Epstein look like a nice guy. Pope John was eventually deposed as both ruler of Rome and Pope, but subsequently regained both offices, brutally mutilating prisoners captured in his victory. He is said to have died in the act of committing adultery. Pope Benedict IX was also accused of rape, murder, and other atrocities, while Pope Boniface VIII demolished several towns while feuding with a powerful family. You don't know any of this. All you do is turn on the media and you hear the Pope is sick, this Pope now, and they talk in hushed, sacred tones. If we do not have the ability to speak about any figure, any political figure in this country, in this world, with some degree of truth, what's the point of having a media? What's the point of having free speech? As we saw what just happened with Zelensky, the warmonger, the maniac, the drug addict, in my opinion, who came here and spit in our president and vice president's face and was thrown out on his behind. They're turning him into the hero. That's what the left does. Were the church not nourished by the Holy Spirit, it might never have survived some of its darker times. Did you hear what I just said? But it did survive. And in modern times, the Catholic Church and the papacy have concerned themselves with much more than saving souls than politics. That's not to say the Pope should have no political opinions at all. Pope Pius XI, who was actually the sitting Pope when the Reichskondat was signed, said the following. He said, when politics come near the altar, then religion, the church, the pontiff, have not only the right but the duty to give directions and indications to be followed by Catholics. So what did he mean by when politics come near the altar? It means when governments infringe upon or attempt to influence the church on spiritual matters. That's precisely the opposite of the Pope using his position as spiritual leader to influence politics. But that's what Pope Francis has been doing. Not only has he abused the trust placed in him for political purposes, he sold out to the socialists who'd love to abolish all religion if they could get away with it. You heard me right. Pius XII, as I just told you, who I defended, was wrongly called Hitler's Pope. The charge didn't fit the facts, as the author who wrote the book eventually admitted himself. But Pope Francis can very appropriately be called Lenin's Pope. Please let's consider the facts supporting that particular charge. Would you like to do that? Or would you like to sit there and worship a man who is a politician in Pope's clothing? Just 8 months after taking office, Pope Francis published Evangelii Gaudium, an apostolic exhortation in which he makes the same spurious criticisms of capitalism that Lenin used to lead the Bolshevik Revolution. Did you know that? This Pope made the same spurious criticisms of capitalism that Lenin used to lead the Bolshevik Revolution. Let me give you one example. This is what Pope Francis published 8 months after taking office. He wrote it, not me. We can no longer trust in the unseen forces and the invisible hand of the market. Growth in justice requires more than economic growth. While presupposing such growth, it requires decisions, programs, mechanisms, and processes specifically geared to a better distribution of income, the creation of sources of employment, and an integral promotion of the poor, which goes beyond a simple welfare mentality. Now, the left always talks about the free market as if it were being run by someone and income was being distributed. That's counterintuitive. By definition, a free market does not run according to a plan, and no one decides how income is distributed. Each individual decides whether to buy or sell, at what price, and at what quantity. They are not told what to do by anyone. That's why they call it free. The Pope doesn't believe freedom works. He wants decisions, programs, mechanisms, and processes to be imposed on people. He wants income redistributed, meaning forcibly taken from some people and arbitrarily handed out to others. This is just what Lenin did after the 1917 revolution in Russia. He implemented decisions, programs, mechanisms, and processes based on Karl Marx's maxim, quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, unquote. Well, guess how that worked out? Things got so bad in Russia that Lenin was in danger of being deposed by 1921. The Soviet Union survived only because Lenin's new economic policy restored some semblance of a market economy. The Soviets, the Vietnamese, and the Chinese all learned the hard way that communism does not work. They all abandoned it on their own after suffering miserably trying to make it work. We often refer to China as Communist China because the Communist Party still asserts autocratic rule over the political process. But China might be less communist economically today than England. In some ways, China is the most capitalist society on earth. The United States doesn't have a completely capitalist system. The free market has been continually altered since the progressive assault on it began over 100 years ago. We have a mixed economy, like Europe, although the United States has more capitalism than socialism in the mix, at least for now. Perhaps it'll get better under Trump. But politicians still interfere with the peaceful exchanges of property that would occur without interference in a free market. Too often, voters choose politicians based on how much of other people's money they're going to get or what industries are going to get subsidies or favors. China's system is very similar. They just don't bother with the fraud of elections. Americans went to the polls back in 2014. They voted against the leftist policies of the imposter in the White House. They said yet to the Communist Democrat Party of America. What was the result? The next day, the arrogant lame duck president laughed at us and said our votes don't count because only a small number of people voted, meaning white people and working people. That was Obama. He said, wait until 2016 when I flood America with 20 million illegal aliens and fill the streets with Occupy movement radicals. I'll get them all registered and they'll all vote. Then you'll see who really runs this country, unquote. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that's what Obama really meant. China practices the same sort of state-directed capitalism as the United States without the political need to appeal to voters. There are no elections. I'll bet you didn't know that. Instead, everything is done through bribery. If you want to start a business in China, make sure you bribe the right government officials. Sounds like some states. In America, you may not have to bribe politicians directly in order to start a business, but you do have to pay for permits. If you want to build a house, you know that. There are permits for that also. If you want your kids to go to an elite college, you might have to make a, quote, donation to fund a new building or an academic department. It's bribery in all but name. The Chinese are more honest about it. They just hand over $5,000 gift cards directly and dispense with the whitewashing. Say what you want about them. Their economy is booming while ours continues, let us say, to falter, regardless of phony government statistics under Biden indicating it's recovered. It still hasn't recovered under Trump, by the way. It's new, it's early, it's soon. In any way, my point is, in any case, China's not a communist state. They learned the hard way how lethal communism is. They paid an even bigger price in human life than Russia, where full communism was abandoned earlier. But every country that has tried communism has had the same results. Even Vladimir Putin, name in the news, admits it was a mistake. He reminded President Obama about the horrors of communism at Davos back in 2009 in an attempt to dissuade Obama from pursuing his $800 billion disaster of a mortgage bailout. He said in the 20th century, the Soviet Union made the state's role absolute. In the long run, this made the Soviet economy totally uncompetitive. This lesson cost us dearly, said Putin. I am sure nobody wants to see it repeated. I'm trying to tell you that Putin is not a communist. Closer to communism would be Zelensky, who has completely made elections illegal, shut down all opposition newspapers, will not hold elections. So who's the real Soviet amongst those two? But let's go back to the Pope. Apparently, Pope Francis does want to see it repeated. Not only is the Pope, or did the Pope advocate thoroughly discredit socialist theories, he completely misinformed. He himself is completely misinformed on the economic conditions he says he wants to improve. He mentions inequality 11 times in his apostolic exhortation, calling it the root of all social ills. That's what he called about capitalism. And says it is increasingly evident, he says, the need to resolve the structural causes of poverty cannot be delayed. This is the Pope, the real Pope. He reiterated this in a letter to the president of Panama, a couple of years ago. This is the Pope, who they're glorifying now on all news channels. He wrote this. Inequality, he wrote, the unfair distribution of riches and resources, is source for conflicts and violence among peoples because it involves the progress of some to be built on the necessary sacrifice of others, and to live with dignity, they have to fight against the rest. There's only one problem. By every objective measure, inequality is not increasing. It was decreasing at rate orders of magnitude greater than at any time in human history. According to The Economist, the poverty rate worldwide, even as of 2016 or 2015, was cut in half in the past 20 years. Why? Because so many countries shifted away from the kind of socialist policies Pope Francis advocates and toward the free market system he condemns. I'm not saying the Pope is evil. Get me straight. I pray for him. He probably believes the things he says just as millions of leftist voters do. Why wouldn't he? Do you know who he actually is? Pope Francis was born and raised in socialist South America. He was immersed in anti-capitalist thinking his entire life. He probably believes in socialism as much as American businessmen believe in free enterprise. As The Economist said of an interview the Pope gave in 2014, by positing a link between capitalism and war, he seems to be taking an ultra-radical line, one that consciously or unconsciously follows Vladimir Lenin in his diagnosis of capitalism and imperialism as the main reason why World War broke out a century ago. Shall I go on? I will. As you can see, I'm not alone in recognizing the influence of Lenin on the Holy See. Whether it is conscious or unconscious, it is still socialism and terribly destructive. For a man whom billions trust to hold these views is terribly dangerous for a world in need of more freedom, not less. This is why borders and culture are important. It is no accident that the first non-European pope, that's Francis, in 1,200 years, would have these radical views. Did you know he was the first non-European pope in 1,200 years? Did you know he had radical views? We believe the things we are raised to believe. If you elect a pope from a socialist country, as Argentina was for most of Pope Francis's life, you should expect him to have socialist views on the economy. When you allow millions of people from a socialist country to cross your border and eventually become citizens who vote, you should expect socialist representatives and eventually socialist laws. Look at the EU. This is all the more dangerous because the people destroying your freedom believe they're right. It's very hard to accept that the things you have been taught since you were a child are wrong. People living in socialist countries have been taught all their lives that free enterprise is something to be feared rather than embraced. They have been taught that business owners exploit workers, not give them a living, rather than giving them an opportunity to be far more productive than they could be on their own. They say that they're exploiting workers. There's more to go on about this. Power can come in many forms. Certainly, we have seen with our last crypto Marxist president an example of stupid ideas combined with great power. That was Biden. He wielded that power directly as commander-in-chief of our military and executor of our laws. Large voting blocks also yield great power, although they wield it directly by deciding who holds office. When you deliberately invite tens of millions of people with very bad ideas into your nation, as Biden did, and give them a path to citizenship, you are investing them with the power to elect the people who will eventually harm you. The Pope wields the third kind of power. That is the power to influence ideas. Millions of honest Catholics look to the Pope for guidance on how to live a good Christian life. When he's guiding people on how to emulate Jesus in their personal lives, he is a tremendous, tremendous force for good in the world. But when he's acting as a political operative, he's just the opposite. Besides, with all due respect, he didn't know what he was talking about. It's a little like medicine. The United States has the greatest doctors in the world when it comes to diagnosing and treating acute illnesses. That's what they're trained to do. And no system trained them better than America's former free market healthcare industry. If you get a serious illness and the most effective treatment is medicine or surgery, there is nowhere on earth where you're in better hands than with an American medical doctor. Well, at least for now. However, medical doctors are not experts in nutrition, in wellness, or in preventing you from getting sick and needing their help. This is something I know a lot about. Medical doctors can tell you exactly what is going on with your body and can suggest medical solutions. But as far as living a healthier life when you're not sick, they're little more than very intelligent people. When they're giving you the same nutritional or fitness advice as Michelle Obama, you may want to do some research on your own. The same goes for the Pope. He doesn't hold a degree in economics. He's never run a business. On economics, he's less qualified than most Catholic business people who at least work in the private sector and understand the realities of the business world. The Pope has a few years' experience as a chemical engineer, a janitor, and a bouncer in a bar. These are all honest professions, but hardly qualify him to opine on complex economic subjects. Unfortunately, millions of Catholics believe they have to agree with him on economics, even though he knows less about it than they do. The church dogma of papal infallibility helps bolster this misconception. Many well-meaning Catholics believe they have to agree with the Pope on everything because they're taught he's infallible. My Catholic friends, I have news for you. You don't have to agree with the Pope on economics to be a good Catholic. The church doesn't teach that. And in all fairness, even Pope Francis has said this. He said, I am only infallible if I speak ex cathedra, but I shall never do that, so I am not infallible. Think about that one. I am only infallible, he said, if I speak ex cathedra, but I shall never do that, so I am not infallible. Figure that one out. The church defines papal infallibility very narrowly. They only consider him infallible when in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole church. In other words, on other subjects, his opinion is just that, an opinion. When he tells Catholics to care about the poor and work towards a world with less poverty and suffering, he's advancing the message of Jesus. But when he opines on the best economic system to make that happen, he is out of his depth. He was similarly out of his depth when he supported dear leader Obama's overture toward Cuba. First, he hosted meetings between Raul Castro and President Obama at the Vatican. Did you know that? Then his Secretary of State issued a letter applauding the historic decision taken by the governments of the United States of America and Cuba to establish diplomatic relations with the aim of overcoming, in the interest of the citizens of both countries, the difficulties which have marked their recent history. Now, there have been arguments made by conservative free market proponents to establish diplomatic relations and trade with Cuba as a way of showing Cuba's people the benefits of capitalism and eventually inspiring them to overthrow Castro and the Marxists. But that's not what Lenin's Pope had in mind. He didn't see the Castro regime as evil and in need of being overthrown. He considered it at least equal to the American government. He probably believed, and may even still believe, that the regime in Cuba would treat its people better after he stuck his nose into international relations. But exactly the opposite happened. Immediately after Obama announced sweeping changes to U.S. policy on Cuba, the communist regime banned a free speech protest in Havana. Not only did the government arrest 3 dissidents before the event was started, it cut off calls to the organizer's cell phone. Instead of the prison island becoming more liberated or more liberal, it had become more draconian. I can read more about this. I can tell you much more about it. But I'll now go up to this issue of the Pope attacking free speech. And I wrote this in Government Zero. It's still true, or I wouldn't read it to you today. And believe me, I did a lot of soul searching before even doing this show today. He is sick and we pray for his recovery. But he did attack free speech. He is a naked socialist. I called him Lenin's Pope for a reason. And that's why I wish Lenin's Pope would spend more time condemning the jihadists torturing and beheading Christians instead of attacking free markets and free speech. Did you hear that one? Did you know that just a few weeks ago, thousands of black Christians in Africa had their heads cut off in a public square by black Islamists? The Muslims in Africa are killing Christians. He said nothing about it. He couldn't even bring himself to condemn the horrific murders of the employees in France who were attacked by Islamist murderers at the time. In fact, when that happened, he actually made excuses for the Islamofascist murderers, just as progressive socialists like him do at every opportunity. It would have floored me if I didn't see through this fakir from the beginning. He's the perfect complement to our progressive Islamist president. That was Obama. Pope Francis says free speech should be limited. Did you know that? And one can expect to be answered with violence for saying something insulting. That's what the Pope said. The definition of free speech is the right to say controversial, even insulting things without fearing violence, either by the government or individuals. People don't have to like what you say or agree with you. They can say insulting things back. The appropriate response is to answer them with reason or ignore them, not break into their offices and gun them down. Thomas Jefferson actually refuted this Pope directly when he said, "The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 guards or no guard. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg," he said. Jefferson said something we all learned in kindergarten. Simple. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but names can never hurt me. He's talking about government power rather than violence committed by individuals. But the principle is the same. The reason governments aren't allowed to infringe upon free speech, at least in America, well, it's not true in England, by the way. They're arresting people for praying outside abortion clinics. England has become a fascist dictatorship under Starmer, by the way. The same is happening throughout Europe as they cater to the Islamofascists, incidentally. When the police in England show up to enforce the law, they don't hand you an invitation. In England, they take you away and use violence if you resist. That's what happened to England. But here in America, we have a First Amendment. And the principle behind the First Amendment is that speech itself, regardless of how offensive, cannot justifiably be answered with violence. Again, this is cultural. I'm not surprised at all by Pope Francis's view on how speech should be limited. He said that. He's the product of a socialist culture where stifling free speech goes hand in hand with stifling economic freedom. You can't have free speech in a socialist society. Too many people would start asking each other why they're working so hard and still getting poorer and poorer. I know. Your whole life you were told, oh, watch out for those right wingers. Those right wingers will take away your freedom of speech. Those right wingers will tell you what art you can produce. Yes, all those fears were valid, but you were afraid of the wrong people. When you have a damaged optic chiasma, you see everything upside down and backward. It's not the people who want the government to leave you alone that are the problem. It's the ones who want it to help you that you should be afraid of. I know this firsthand. You may not remember this, but I'm the only member of the American media who is not permitted to enter Britain based on statements I never even made. Did you know that I'm banned from entering Britain? As I said, facts don't matter to the English. It wasn't right-wingers who banned me from Britain, but Britain's wonderful, caring, liberal Labour Party. They did it to me in 2019, I think. No, it's so long ago, I don't even remember. I cannot enter Britain. These are the great defenders of free speech. And when the Conservatives came to power, they did not overturn the ban. They were about as conservative as Hollow Man, any Hollow Man you want to fill in. Don't forget that the First Amendment doesn't just protect free speech. It's also about the separation of church and state. When did the Catholic Church become so brazen as to suddenly step over that important firewall? I'll tell you, when the Catholic Church was given billions of dollars by the federal government to help usher in millions and millions of illegal aliens because they need their pews filled with illiterates from Central America, that's when it happened. Once the Catholic Church and Baptist Family Services and Lutheran Family Services and certain Jewish and Protestant organizations were corrupted by first Obama with billions of dollars in taxpayer-funded resettlement programs, the churches, the synagogues, and others became useless as institutions of religion and instead became arms of the community organizer, Barack Obama. So it's much more than about free speech. It's about destroying all semblances of civilized society. Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot weren't the only communists who committed atrocities. All of them did. Look up the 1944 Battle of Meligalas in Greece. Calling it a battle is disingenuous. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. The communists killed everyone in Greece who was not a communist. So I go to the Pope now, and I ask, what is the Pope defending? And then I talk about the Pope promoting junk science. I can go into that for an entire 20 minutes of this. I can tell you all about the Vostok ice core samples. I can talk about the real agenda behind the climate change scam. I can go on for 30 more minutes. I can talk about the Marxist encyclical on care for a communist home. Remember when I said that the church limits papal infallibility to a very, very narrow range of subjects? Well, encyclicals have traditionally been issued by popes on only the most important religious issues. That naturally limits them to subjects the author knows something about. But Pope Francis threw that principle out the window for purely political reasons. His Laudato Si on care for our common home is a thinly veiled political manifesto combining pronouncements on both economics and climate science the Pope has no expertise in whatsoever. In it, he takes all of the scientific and economic fallacies I've already talked about and stamps them with the official seal of the church. The encyclical opens with some quotes from St. Francis of Assisi that appear cherry-picked to sound like the leftist New Age Gaia narrative. That's no accident. The Pope's scientific advisor for this letter is the radical Gaia worshiper and climate hoax scientist Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber. Consider this passage. In the words of this beautiful canticle, St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us and who produces various fruit and colored flowers and herbs. Now, Pope Francis's poetic language here may sound like paganism, but not when taken within the whole context of his writing. He was certainly very concerned about the environment and all of God's creatures, but he didn't worship the earth itself as a goddess, as the pagans did. Neither did he consider it a living organism, as the modern secular Gaia cult does. But look where the Pope takes that imagery in the next paragraph. Listen to this. This sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. That did not come from St. Francis. It came from the Pope. Or should I say it came from Schellnhuber, as this is straight Gaia cult nonsense. I say this, as the earth is alive and human beings are inflicting violence upon her, sure, and we have to be careful about that. But Schellnhuber's beliefs include a whole range of radical ideas that would horrify most Catholics. Not only does he embrace the idea that the earth is a living, conscious organism, but he sees human beings as a threat that must be diminished. He has said that, quote, the carrying capacity of the earth is below 1 billion people. We now have 7 billion. Although he's backed away from that statement when confronted, Schellnhuber, who wrote this for the Pope, belongs to a whole subgroup of radical liberal environmentalists who believe the human population must be vastly decreased to save their earth goddess. In fairness to the Pope, he somewhat disclaims this portion of Schellnhuber's insane worldview, although he wish he was and had been a bit more emphatic. So the Pope said that he has to find solutions for these problems between these extremes. But what did he mean? Do we just need to eliminate a few billion people, not 6 billion, as Schellnhuber implies, with his carrying capacity nonsense? How can there be any compromise at all with these insane theories? With Schellnhuber advising him and his own Marxist biases, Pope Francis has produced a gargantuan piece of leftist propaganda that includes just about every hard left fallacy ever foisted upon the gullible, including the Gaia cult narrative, the climate change hoax, Marxist thoroughly discredited economic theories, and the standard class warfare a demagogic left wing promotes every chance it gets. He even manages to work in a deferential reference to Islam, quoting an Islamic poet in a footnote to a passage on the, quote, mystical meaning to be found in a leaf, in a mountain trail, in a dewdrop, in a poor person's face. All very sentimental and beautiful. But there ought to be an impeachment process for popes when they use the power of their office to mislead the faithful so egregiously. Throughout his treatise, the Pope cries excessive consumption as one of the root causes of both environmental damage and global poverty. If you and I would just lower our standard of living, everything would be fine. Of course, the Pope doesn't seem to realize there is something quite hypocritical about a man who flies around the world on a Vatican jet, lecturing the rest of us about our standard of living. Like all socialists, he believes he is an exception to his own rules about what wealth everyone else is entitled to. Vatican jet, Vatican guards, Vatican wall. No walls for America, though. He certainly has some rules in mind for your money. He confirms the real agenda behind the global warming hoax right here. To blame population growth instead of extreme and selective consumerism on the part of some is one way of refusing to face the issues. It is an attempt to legitimize the present model of distribution, where a minority believes that it has the right to consume in a way which can never be universalized, since the planet could not even contain the waste products of such consumption. Isn't that convenient? We need a different model of distribution, meaning government redistribution of wealth, because if everyone consumed as much as the minority, there would be too much waste. This is so illogical, it's hard to know where to start. Well, I deconstruct all of this in my writings. But Marx's theory of overproduction was a foundational plank in Das Kapital, or Capital in English. That was Karl Marx, exactly what the Pope was putting forward. Marx argued that a capitalist system results in firms producing so much that they force down the prices of their own goods, thereby diminishing profits and ultimately necessitating layoffs. Workers find themselves poor in the midst of plenty, unable to afford the goods they previously produced. This is the root cause of what Marx described as the inevitable crisis of capitalism. Never happened, by the way. This is what the Pope refers to when he says irrational production results in negative results in regional economies. He very appropriately links alarmism about destruction of the environment to this communist claptrap. After all, promoting Marxism is what the environment movement is really about. Academia still hangs on to Marx's lunatic ravings, even after history has proven him wrong over and over again. Over the course of the 19th century, consumer prices did fall dramatically as productive capacity and efficiency increased. But it didn't make workers poorer, it made them richer, especially since wages went up, even as prices went down. These facts are not in dispute. Marx's theory didn't even make logical sense in a classroom. And I won't go into the theories of Marxism here, it's all in my book. I'll just conclude by reading this to you. Regardless, the Pope is still pushing the same program as our Marxist president. That was Obama. And then, of course, it became, in some ways, it was Biden, who was more of a criminal than he was a Marxist. But they're one and the same when you think about it. The Pope wants the most productive people in America and other first world nations to lower their living standards to accommodate wealth redistribution to third world nations, even as he and the golfer in chief continue to live like kings, just as Stalin did in his communist paradise. Somehow, this will also save the world from global warming. I'll read this now from the Pope, and then I'm concluding. This is why the time has come, wrote the Pope, to accept decreased growth in some parts of the world in order to provide resources for other places to experience healthy growth. Benedict XVI has said that, quote, technologically advanced societies must be prepared to encourage more sober lifestyles while reducing their energy consumption and improving its efficiency. That's the Pope. This is the same reasoning that produced the war on poverty in America, which has given us record numbers of people on food stamps at the time and other forms of government welfare. Obama, the Pope, and the rest of the Marxist progressives want to employ the same model on a worldwide scale. And I wrote, heaven help us if they succeed. So that was my chapter on Lenin's Pope, From Government Zero, written quite a few years ago. Unfortunately, nothing has changed. And I want to conclude at this time by saying we pray for the Pope's health. But you must not forget that he's only a man, and a socialist man at that. There's another very important piece that I would like to touch on when it comes to climate change or global warming. Many of you heard me talk about the Vostok ice core samples many times. I think it belongs here right now. This could be a whole separate broadcast, and maybe I should do it as a separate broadcast. It's called Inconvenient Research, the Vostok ice core samples. Shall I read it to you now? I will read it to you now because the Pope is completely ignorant of the Vostok ice core samples. Most of you have never heard of the Vostok ice core samples, but have you ever heard about Al Gore's big lie sample? Well, look up the Vostok ice core sample. This research is very important. It's real data. It's not created by Al Gore. It's not created for the Pope. It was obtained by drilling down into the ice above Lake Vostok in Antarctica to a depth of 10,000 feet. That's 2 miles down into the ice. French and Russian scientists obtained deep core samples, allowing them to look at, among other things, the history of temperature and carbon dioxide over the last 420,000 years. Have I lost you already because it's real science, not propaganda? Well, I'll go on. They pulled up these samples, and they did show that increases in carbon dioxide always accompanied increases in temperature. But the increases in temperature always came first. The increases in carbon dioxide consistently lag behind temperature increases by about 800 years. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Carbon dioxide levels did increase after the temperature on the Earth increased. It was not carbon dioxide driving the increase in the temperature on the Earth. This proves that increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere did not cause warming. How could it have if it didn't happen until after the warming? This knocks over the whole house of cards. But that's not all the Vostok ice core samples tell us. 325,000 years ago, 325,000 years ago, global temperatures and carbon dioxide levels were higher than they are today. Did you know that? I guess the Pope and the warmists didn't get any of this when they were at Columbia, NYU, or Harvard, learning how to become community agitators. In fact, as I wrote in this book, government zero back then. We are right now near the end of another warm interglacial, the end of another warm interglacial. And those of us who are educated in science know we're actually heading into another glacial cooling period where global temperatures will drop and ice will again form heavily at the poles. It's already happening. The Antarctic has just had the greatest growth of ice in a very long period of time. Don't take my word for it, research it yourself. So, what can we say about this group of political radicals and their fake climate change research? In short, they don't do scientific research scientifically. Their data is not representative of the Earth's climate as a whole. They don't control for other causes of temperature change. Their methodology and results are not approved by their peers other than those bought off by the politicians. But that's not the most damning evidence against this scam. I can read you a lot more about this, and I can talk about junk journalism for junk science, and I will do so at another time. But I thought that for today, we should talk about the Pope while wishing and praying for his recovery and his health. Again, I am not Catholic, so forgive me if I'm stepping on some sensibilities here today. But I think the Catholic Church, the modern Catholic Church, is a beautiful institution. The Church has had many different popes over thousands of years, some good, some bad, some evil, some moronic, some vulgar, some perverted, and some just outright wrong. This is Michael Savage. Thank you very much for listening. With God's will and your viewership, I shall return.